So I want to invite you today to press reset. And there's a particular way in which I want to invite you to reset your life. You see, we live in a world of distraction. We live in an atmosphere of algorithms and advertisements that are constantly trying to steal away our attention. And it leads us to living lives that are increasingly distracted. And I want to offer an antidote to a life of distraction. The antidote to a life of distraction is to practice presence, to live an attentive life, to learn the art of one thing at a time. See, we're in Luke 5, 33 to 35, and in it, the Pharisees come to Jesus and they're upset with him because the way of his disciples is so different to the way of their disciples and John the Baptist. We can read it in Luke 5, 33 to 35, and it says this: They said to him, John's disciples often fast and pray, and so do the disciples of the Pharisees, but yours go on eating and drinking. Jesus answered, Can you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is with them? But the time will come when the bridegroom will be taken from them. In those days they will fast. You see, the Pharisees, their way was a way of rigorously following rules because that was the way to please God. And so their disciples were the same, rigorously following all these set rules. John the Baptist's way was to live a life of austerity, to have an austere diet of locusts and wild honey, to wear camel's hair and to live in the desert. Because the message of John was that the thing that people needed most was God himself. But then along comes Jesus' disciples and they live totally differently. They are feasting when everybody else is fasting. And the Pharisees are really upset that that is what they're doing. And so they ask the question, why? Why are your disciples different, Jesus? Well, Jesus gives a really clear answer. He says, will you make the guests of the bridegroom fast while he is still with them? You see, what Jesus says is that how his disciples live are based on who they are with. That the thing that shapes their lives most is his presence. In fact, he says, when I'm with them, they'll feast, and when I'm not with them, they'll fast. Their lives will look completely different, dependent on my presence. Now, Jesus actually uses this image of a wedding feast, right? He describes himself as a bridegroom and of his disciples as the guests of the bridegroom. Actually, what he's describing is the image of a wedding feast, that life with Jesus is like being a guest at a wedding feast. Now, let's think about a wedding feast for a moment. A wedding feast was a celebration of a marriage. A marriage is two people coming together in an intimate union. It's a moment of deep, committed, loyal relationship. And what's a feast? A feast is a time where everybody comes together, family, friends, neighbours, work colleagues, people. In those days, probably the whole town would have come together for a feast. So a wedding feast was a celebration of communion with community. Literally everything about a wedding feast is relationship. It's about relationship. And it's such an important reminder for us to remember that to follow the way of Jesus is not ultimately about following a set of beliefs, but rather coming to know a person. It's not a list of things to do, but a person to be with. Now, actually, this is interesting because if at the center of life with Jesus is relationship, often in our language around discipleship, we talk about living for Jesus. And living for Jesus is about doing, it's about productivity, it's about achievement. But here, Jesus describes his way as a way of relationship, not a way of work, but a way of relationship. It's not about doing, it's about being. It's not about productivity, it's about presence. It's not about achievement, it's about attentiveness. We are not invited first and foremost to live for Jesus, but the way of Christ is to be invited to live with Jesus. Now, let me ask you a question. When you think about following Christ, do you think about more living for Jesus, or do you think about living with Jesus? Another question, what do you find easier? Do you find it easier to live for Jesus, to do things for him, or to be with him? I'd like you to, once you've found the answer to that question, ask yourself why. Why is it that I find it easier to do this thing? Final question, if Jesus defines his way as a way of relationship, that it's not about first and foremost living for, but rather living with, what's higher up in your priorities? Doing things for Jesus or being with him? And that's not to say that there isn't validity in living for Christ. Certainly Jesus calls us to do things for him, but it flows out of being with him. What's higher up on your priorities? To live for Jesus or to live with Jesus? So let's now look at the greatest commandment, right? Because if Jesus says that to follow him is to live with him, it's about being, not doing. It's about presence, not productivity. It's about attentiveness, not achievement. It's the language of relationship rather than the language of work. This actually makes an awful lot of sense. It fits together with the rest of Jesus' teaching, because what Jesus says is the greatest commandment is to love the Lord your God with what? With all your heart, mind, soul, and strength. At the foundation of walking with Jesus is relationship with God. But here's the thing. Do you hear what it says? Love God with all your heart, with all your mind, with all your soul, with all your strength. That actually to enjoy a relationship with God doesn't just require his presence. It requires all of our presence. Actually the only thing required of you as a wedding guest was showing up. Everything else was laid out for you. The work was already done. Everything was a free gift. The only thing that was asked of you was your presence. Now, a wedding feast in those days was not one day. It was between 5 to 7 days. It was like a week-long celebration of relationship. It would happen usually in the autumn when the harvest had been brought in and the vintage had finished, which meant that people worried about provision and work. They could just be present. And the autumn was a perfect time for kind of long, late nights of celebration, full of music and dancing and gifts and prayer and feasting and friendship. And the amazing thing about the wedding feast was that all of it was free. It all was provided by the hospitality of the host. The only thing you had to do was show up. The one thing required of you to enjoy the fullness of the feast was your presence. Now, in my experience of weddings, I'm a church leader, and so often weddings are on Saturdays and church gatherings are on a Sunday, which often means that Sunday's a work day. And so it gets towards the end of the evening when the party starts, right? We have only one day, whereas the Jews, they had 5, 6, 7 days of celebration. We try and cram it all into one. But it gets towards the end of the day when the dancing begins and the celebration begins, and that's the moment where I start to think about travel times. I start to think about how long is it going to take me to get home, and what time of night am I going to arrive home to be ready for work the next day. And instead of being fully present in the moment, I start to think about all of these factors of when's the right time to leave so I don't offend people, but also I need to get home because I've got work the next day. And it's just an awkward moment. And actually what happens is that none of it's fulfilling. So I don't find the celebration as fulfilling as it could have been because I'm so distracted. But then also my work the next day is not as fulfilling because I'm tired and distracted from all the travel and everything that's been going on. Actually, this divided sense within me robs me of a truly fulfilling experience. Maybe you've found that in your life. Maybe you found that there are moments where you find yourself divided and distracted. Maybe have you ever tried that where you've had a conversation with someone and they get out their phone and start texting at the same time? Or maybe you sit down to watch a movie and start scrolling through social media at the same time. What happens is that none of these things become as fulfilling as they could be because we are distracted, not giving our full attention to anything. Actually, I wonder if perhaps we are living lives where we're so afraid of missing out on anything that we spend our time chasing after everything, but all of it is ultimately unfulfilling because we haven't given ourselves wholeheartedly to anything. Actually, what happens is that when we live distracted lives and we chase after many things, we end up just dipping our toe in the water of everything. We live a life full of shallow experiences. Walter Brueggemann, in his book Sabbath as Resistance, he says this about a life of multitasking. He says, multitasking is the drive to be more than we are, to control more than we do, to extend our power and effectiveness. Such practice yields a divided self with full attention given to nothing. Now, hear this again. Multitasking is the drive to be more than we are, to control more than we do, to extend our power and effectiveness. Such practice yields a divided self with full attention given to nothing. Now, when you think about the way of Christ being described as a wedding feast, the best feasts are not the ones where we do everything. They're not the ones where we dance to every song, talk to every person, eat every kind of food, drink every kind of drink. No, the best feasts are the ones where we give ourselves wholeheartedly to a few things, where we listen attentively, where we dance wholeheartedly, when we drink slowly, when we laugh from our bellies and talk from our hearts. These are the moments that we remember, right? Those moments where we have a conversation that lasts way into the night, where we've given our whole attention to just one person without any distraction. See, this is the gift of a feast. The gift of a wedding feast is not finding fullness in many things. The gift of a wedding feast is finding fullness in giving your whole self to only a few things. And Jesus, he describes his way as a wedding feast. That life with Christ is the same, that the gift of life with Christ is to find fullness not in doing many, many things, but in giving our whole selves wholeheartedly to only a few. So I wonder if actually we need to liberate ourselves from lives of distraction, where we need to live lives of attentiveness, of giving our whole selves to just a few things. And so I want to invite you to learn the art of doing just one thing at a time. Learn the art of one thing at a time. A life of attentiveness, where you're less focused on being productive and more focused on being present. Less focused on achievement and more focused on attentiveness. Just to read the book, just to listen to your children, just to talk with your spouse, just to watch the movie or walk in the hills or to pray to God, just to be attentive, to do the one thing instead of wanting to do many things, to go deep with one instead of having many shallow experiences. Now, I wonder if actually our disconnection with God and those moments where we feel anxious and worried and stressed out, and we find ourselves not living the kind of fullness of life that Jesus offers us, I wonder if that's less to do with God's absence and more to do with ours. That actually God is with us, but we are not with him. Because we're told to love God with all our heart, mind, soul, and strength. That a life of relationship is not just about God's presence with us, but our presence with him. And I wonder if actually because of the lives of distractions that we've lived, that we find it difficult to just be with God, because we find it difficult to just be with anyone or anything. We find it difficult not to become distracted because we've not learnt the art of one thing. We've not practiced presence, to be with a few instead of trying to chase after many. And so I wonder if actually, when it comes to prayer, I wonder if maybe we need to liberate ourselves in the act of prayer. That maybe we need to stop worrying about whether our prayers are achieving anything or producing anything, and just showing up, just being present. I wonder what our Father in heaven would feel like if we, his children, his sons and daughters, just came to him and said, Lord, we're here today, we're present today, not to achieve anything, not to produce anything, but just to be with you. Lord, I don't need you to answer any requests. I don't need you to do anything in my heart. I just want to be with you. You see, this is the thing about living with Christ rather than living for Christ, is that this way of living invites us to recover the idea that actually we're not primarily human doings, but we're actually primarily human beings. And that our lives can be full of the language of relationship. To be rather than to do. To be present rather than to produce. To be attentive rather than to achieve. Actually, I'll end our time together with the story of Mary and Martha. In Luke 10, Jesus visits Mary and Martha's home. And Martha gets to work. She starts living for Jesus. She starts working in the kitchen, preparing the meal. She's busy doing and producing and achieving so that Jesus might have this great experience in her home. But while she's busy doing and achieving and producing, inwardly she's becoming anxious and stressed and actually resentful and bitter. And she turns around to Jesus and she says, Jesus, don't you care that I'm working so hard and carrying all this weight upon myself? I wonder if actually we might find that in our own lives we've become anxious and stressed and worried because we've chosen to live a life for Jesus rather than a life with Jesus. And actually inwardly we've become resentful of God. We're like, God, this is not the kind of life that I wanted. This is not the kind of burden that you promised. And actually Jesus is saying, no, I need you to live with me first. I need you to choose the language of relationship over the language of work. I need you to practice presence. Because actually what happens is Mary, she goes and sits at Jesus' feet. And she's not producing. And she's not doing. She's not achieving. She's just being present and attentive. And what Jesus says to Martha, I want to read it to you. Martha, Martha, the Lord answered, you are worried and upset about many things, but only one thing is needed. Mary has chosen what is better, and it will not be taken away from her. Martha chose to live for Jesus, and she found herself anxious about many things. Mary, though, learned the art of one thing at a time. She knew that to live with Jesus was where the life was. She knew that presence was what was most important. She knew that to be attentive to him was where the gold dust was. So the remedy to a life of distraction is to practice presence. To remember that life with God doesn't just require his presence but ours. And that actually all the gifts of life with Christ are dependent on us showing up to love God with all our heart, all our soul, all our mind, all our strength. And we might find in this moment that we can be worried about many things. Jesus would say to us, only one thing is needed. I want you to hear that. Only one thing is needed. Mary chose the better thing. What are you going to choose? Jesus, I pray that we would choose relationship with you over everything else. That you would free us from this need to constantly be producing, to worry and become anxious about many things, and instead to give our attention wholeheartedly to you. To love you with all of our hearts. To love you with all of our mind. To love you with all of our strength. To love you with all of our soul. Lord, this week may we just show up, be present, be real. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. God bless. Love you all, and be present this week.